Our video of the day comes to us from Mexico City, where rioters looted businesses and harassed tourists.
Protesters say the newcomers have driven up rents beyond the reach of locals.
We've all heard about US immigration problems with Mexico, millions crossing the border in search of a better life. But what if I told you the exact same thing is also silently happening in reverse? Between 2019 and 2022, the number of US citizens living in Mexico has jumped 70% and is showing no signs of slowing down. It's very quickly becoming a massive problem for many reasons. But how did it come to this? I mean, what's making some Americans just as desperate as their southern neighbors in crossing the border? Well, to understand this, we need to go back to when the first Americans started coming over. Since the early 1800s, Americans have made their way into Mexico, starting with frontier traders who hunted wild game for fur and settled in the northern territories. Stephen F. Austin, known as the father of Anglo-Texas, led the first legal settlement of Anglo-Americans in Mexican Texas. His settlers, known as the Old 300, were among the first Americans officially welcomed by the Mexican government in 1822. Austin had inherited the colonization contract from his father and successfully negotiated with Mexican authorities to bring American families to these territories. After Spain relinquished control, Mexico actively encouraged American settlement through its General Colonization Law of 1824, which offered land grants to heads of households regardless of nationality. The goal was to develop Mexico's sparsely populated northern frontier. However, as more Americans arrived, they brought different religious practices, language, and crucially, slavery, which Mexico had abolished. These cultural tensions, combined with political changes in Mexico that reduced the autonomy of these settlements, eventually contributed to Texas declaring independence in 1836. Up until the end of the Civil War, an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 enslaved African Americans crossed the border seeking freedom in Mexico, which had abolished slavery in 1829. Enslaved sailors from New Orleans and Galveston, Texas, often jumped ship when they reached Mexican ports. After the Civil War ended in 1865, we saw another wave of American migration, but with very different motivations. Thousands of ex-Confederates who weren't thrilled about losing established colonies like the New Virginia colony, trying to recreate their southern lifestyle in a new country. During the late 19th century, Mexico was ruled by President Porfirio Diaz for over 30 years in what became known as the Porfiriato period. Diaz actively recruited American businessmen to help modernize Mexico's economy through railroads, mining, and industry. These immigrants often integrated more deeply with Mexican society than we see today. They had to learn Spanish simply to run their businesses. Unlike modern expats who can, or should I say will, operate entirely in English, these business owners needed to communicate with Mexican employees, suppliers, and officials to succeed. The 20th century brought waves of American veterans after World War II, seeking to stretch their military pensions in what they called GI paradises, affordable beach towns and cities where their military benefits could buy them a comfortable lifestyle impossible back home. The strong exchange rate meant their modest US government checks transformed into upper middle-class incomes in Mexico. During the Cold War, many artists, filmmakers, and leftists fleeing the witch hunt of McCarthyism were drawn specifically to Mexico's vibrant cultural renaissance. These creative expats often made substantial contributions and efforts to integrate. Throughout most of this history, Americans concentrated in specific regions based on climate, landscape, and lifestyle preferences. Beach towns like Cancun attracted sunseekers. Colonial cities like San Miguel de Allende became artist havens after the Instituto Allende opened in 1950. Lake Chapala in Jalisco developed such a large retirement community that it's now said to have the highest expat population outside the US. But Mexico City, interestingly, was largely avoided by American settlers until recently. The capital was seen as too crowded, too polluted, too chaotic, and potentially dangerous. A sprawling metropolis better bypassed in favor of more peaceful colonial towns or beach resorts, many of which are now home to gated communities. It didn't help either that in 1985, an 8.0 magnitude earthquake ripped through the city and led to the deaths of 5,000 people. The inner city, including the now popular places of Roma Norte and Condesa, were hit especially hard because they sit on the remnants of Lake Texcoco, which was drained when the Spanish razed the Aztec island capital of Tenochtitlan to build Mexico City. But in the end, this earthquake is actually what kickstarted the changes to Mexico City. See, with all the damage that happened, inner-city middle-class residents fled by the hundreds of thousands to areas on the city's fringes that they deemed safer. So areas like Roma Norte and Condesa became very cheap, which lured in many artists, turning the area into a creative and intellectual hub. They opened cafes, bookstores, and galleries, eventually turning this area of Mexico City into a trendy bohemian center. As these neighborhoods became revitalized, it eventually, even if unintentionally, began the process of gentrification. By 2016, the New York Times named Mexico City the world's top travel destination, and magazine writers wondered whether it was the new Berlin. This is where the flood of American expats really exploded. International artists, chefs, and designers arrived, scooping up inexpensive studio spaces and integrating themselves into the city's imaginative nightlife. But what we're seeing now, though, is different in almost every way. The scale, speed, and concentration of today's American migration to Mexico is unprecedented, and it's transforming Mexican cities in ways previous waves never did, especially in urban areas that were previously untouched by American influence. If we look at the stats, as I mentioned earlier, between 2019 and 2022, the number of Americans applying for or renewing residency visas in Mexico surged by about 70%, jumping from around 17,800 to over 30,000. And that's just counting the people going through official channels. While it's notoriously complex to account for long-term settlers, dual nationality holders, and temporary visa holders, the State Department now reports a staggering 1.6 million Americans living in Mexico, the largest population of US citizens outside the United States. For comparison, around 1 million Americans live in Canada, and just some 300,000 in the UK. Much of this can be attributed to the pandemic pushing the gentrification process into overdrive. As most of Europe and Asia closed their borders in 2020, Mexico kept theirs wide open, with no requirements needed. This made it one of the only global urban destinations US citizens could freely travel to, and it was just a short flight away. At the same time, remote work suddenly became normalized. Millions of Americans realized they could keep their US salaries while living anywhere with reliable internet. The math was simple. Why pay $4,000 for a cramped apartment in San Francisco when you could live in a spacious place in Mexico City for $1,000? It's not like it was a much different time zone where it would be much harder to work during US hours. Digital nomads quickly figured out how to exploit the Forma Migratoria Multiple system. They'd stay for nearly 6 months, take a quick visa run by leaving the country briefly for a few days, then return for another 6 months, renewing it indefinitely. For Americans working remotely, this dance around migration laws became routine. Many described finding a profound sense of peace and ease in their new lives, a stark contrast to the constant pressure they felt in the US. While the quick visa run today is actively discouraged, gaining a Residente Temporal visa, valid for 4 years, is also easy to obtain. The economic incentives are just too undeniable. Most Americans can live comfortably in Mexico City for just $2,000 per month, a fraction of what it costs in major US cities. Even if we're to look at the most gentrified, upscale neighborhoods like Roma Norte or La Condesa, the rent may be $1,500 a month, where that'd be considered a steal in major US city. Speaking of rental prices, the average rent in La Condesa, for example, one of Mexico City's trendiest neighborhoods, increased by nearly 60% between 2020 and 2023, going from $917 per month to $1,458, and it's even more now. Even the non-gentrified zones have suffered a 3 times price increase from 2000 to 2022. So normally, the response to this would be to try cut down on digital nomadism through policies, as we've seen in popular cities like Barcelona or Lisbon. But in Mexico City, it's actually been the opposite. The government has actually encouraged this influx. In 2022, the city's government partnered with Airbnb and UNESCO to promote the city as a global remote working hub. The move came just 5 years after Mexico City became the first Latin American city to implement a lodging tax on Airbnb. The partnership obviously sparked anger among many Mexicans who were already being priced out of their neighborhoods. According to a study prepared by the Sheinbaum administration, the number of temporary homes tripled between 2000 and 2020, from just over 22,000 to 71,000. At the same time, the report acknowledges more than 20,000 families from the lowest income brackets are forced to leave the city every year due to a lack of affordable housing options. Then, from 2019 to August 2023, short-term rentals in Mexico City increased by about 45%, according to AirDNA data. Now, at this point, I'd like to actually look at these neighborhoods themselves: Polanco, Juarez, and of course Roma Norte and La Condesa. Walk through these trendier, gentrified neighborhoods today and the change is striking. You'll hear almost as much English as Spanish on the streets. Late 19th and early 20th century mansions are being repurposed as chain restaurants and boutiques. Streets once filled with traditional fondas and local markets are now lined with yoga studios and third-wave coffee shops, all with English-first menus, of course. These desirable areas are walkable, tree-lined, and have park-like urban spaces. It's like someone picked up pieces of Brooklyn or San Francisco and dropped them into Mexico City. In some areas, the impact on communities goes beyond rising prices and changing cultures. In Barrio Xoco, one of Mexico City's oldest neighborhoods dating back 1,700 years, residents have lost access to water, public gathering spaces, and even sunlight as luxury high-rises tower over historic structures. With such drastic changes happening over the past few years, it's safe to say that many Mexicans aren't holding back their opinions on this at all. Protest graffiti is everywhere. Some things being said are so crazy that I can't even show them on the screen. But the message is clear. People are angry. They're mourning the loss of community and affordability. Really, the sentiment is felt across the country too. Communities are organizing against what many now view as a living crisis. In Oaxaca, a cultural hub that's experienced a staggering 77% tourism increase since 2020, hundreds took to the streets carrying signs declaring, "Oaxaca is not a commodity." In San Miguel de Allende, the historic center feels more like a theme park version of Mexico designed for tourists than an authentic community. It's simply becoming impossible to live as a Mexican in Mexico City. In fact, a 2022 study by CIA Landlord Insurance, no, not that CIA, found that while Mexico City is very affordable for many foreigners, it was ranked the world's 4th least livable city based on local rents and wages, right behind fellow digital nomad hotspot Lisbon at number 3. Mexico's response to this situation reveals a nation divided on how to handle expats. Many are active participants in this transformation. Property owners, developers, and business owners often welcome American dollars. The financial newspaper El Financiero reported that in 2022, more than 40% of home sales in Mexico City were to foreign buyers. The anger has to be pointed at these people even more than anyone else. It shines a light on the crucial reality. The massive economic disparity between dollars and pesos create market pressures that overwhelm local economic systems. When Americans can pay 3 times what locals can afford, the market distorts. Being the 6th most visited country in the world, it's estimated that almost 9% of Mexico's GDP comes from tourism, similar to that of Japan and France's, which is a significant amount. Many critics decree that Mexico City is becoming less Mexican, which is perhaps true, but it's also becoming more cosmopolitan. And there is a trade-off inherent within. Some Mexican business owners in gentrified areas report feeling caught in an impossible position that describes it well. Either they have to adapt to wealthier clients or close shop entirely. At the other end of the spectrum, some Mexicans embrace gentrification and the economic opportunities it brings, from the benefits to local businesses to making certain neighborhoods safer to live in. Some would even say the problem of gentrification is actually way overstated. For example, if we're to look at the number of temporary or permanent residence permits issued to Americans in Mexico City, it grew by 40% in 2022 to 23, compared with the 2 years before the pandemic. But that's still just about 5,400 people, at least officially, like I said earlier. This number, or even a bit more, isn't really that much. We also need to remember that Mexico City is huge. I mean, it's the most populated city in North America, with over 21 million people living there. In terms of square mileage, it's 15% bigger than Los Angeles, which is famous for being a sprawling metropolis. So with that being said, maybe 95% of Mexico City is still the same as it was years ago. It's just a few places that have become undeniably gentrified. The reality is though, with or without expats, housing in Mexico overall has become incredibly more expensive. From 2005 to 2021, prices throughout Mexico have increased by 247%. Even in states with low tourist flow, such as Morelos, prices have increased 193%, according to data from the Federal Mortgage Association, or FMA for short. There is not a single state in Mexico where the price hasn't more than doubled during that period. In Mexico City specifically, in a trend that mirrors most big cities, they've simply not been building enough housing. The FMA also estimates that in order to meet the city's normal housing needs, at least 11,000 additional homes a year would be required. Other estimates put that figure at 50,000. But in 2023, only 1,701 homes were built in Mexico City. Of those, only 12% were affordable housing, anything under $39,000. As it stands now, at least in terms of dealing with expats, the Congress of Mexico City voted for a reform that will ban landlords from renting out their properties using apps like Airbnb for more than 50% of the year, with the reform intended to reduce unfair competition with hotels. There's also been a proposed legislation to tax digital nomads 103 pesos, or almost $6 a day, after they spent 20 days in the country, recognizing that these aren't just tourists, but de facto residents who should contribute to the systems they use. Outside of this, not much has been done though on a political level, as millions of Americans now call Mexico home, making it the largest population of US citizens outside the US. Both countries face unprecedented questions about their shared border. While the border crisis for entry into America is its own major problem, this one is too. Some Americans in Mexico advocate personal responsibility as the first step toward ethical migration. Learning Spanish rather than expecting locals to accommodate English speakers helps prevent linguistic colonization. Supporting neighborhood businesses rather than chains preserves local character. Building genuine connections with Mexican neighbors transforms foreigners from disruptive outsiders to community participants. Policy, on the other hand, means balancing economic benefits with community preservation. The central irony of this situation remains key to the debate. As American politicians campaign on restricting Mexican migration northward, Americans freely flow south with minimal constraints and more economic power. What ethical migration looks like isn't just a question for Americans in Mexico, but for all people navigating an increasingly connected world. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. See you in the next one.